On this Wednesday night, inflation, frustration. Canada's cost of living keeps climbing.
I don't know how I can handle
the highest inflation rate in 3 decades. And what's compounding problems for people tight on cash. New military reinforcements to resist Russia. Canada's commitment to help Ukraine. Systemic racism infecting Canadian healthcare.
We get asked immediately, like, are you on drugs?
The fight for equality. Plus, raised to the rafters. Honoring Willie O'Ree, the Canadian hockey player who broke the NHL's color barrier.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Sophie Louie.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. New data from Statistics Canada is confirming what many Canadians have likely already noticed. The cost of living in this country is going up fast. Inflation hit 4.8% last month, the highest in 3 decades. To put that in perspective, back in 1991, Brian Mulroney was Canada's Prime Minister. George Bush Sr. was the U.S. President, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. We are paying more for food, transportation, and housing. And after 9 straight months of rising inflation, economists warn the streak may not be over. As Gaviola explains in tonight's top story, that could force the Bank of Canada to respond as early as next week.
This container used to be $75. Right now, $145.
Michelle Lee has been in the restaurant business for more than 30 years, but she's never dealt with a perfect storm like this. Labor shortages, rising wages, Omicron restrictions, and inflation.
We locked down, and I don't know how I can handle.
Overall, year-over-year inflation was 4.8% in December. The biggest drivers, transportation costs rising nearly 9%, shelter up 5.4%, and food going up by 5.2%. The Prime Minister was advised last February most forecasters do not expect inflation to accelerate beyond the Bank of Canada's 3% target in the next few years, according to a memo obtained by Global News through federal access to information law. Well, less than a year later, inflation's been pushing 5% for months now. The opposition's finance critic blames the government's spending and stimulus, saying the U.S. is dealing with raging inflation for the same reason.
The Americans have 7% inflation. Why? Because of their stupid monetary and fiscal policy. It's that simple. They're running massive deficits and printing money to pay for it.
But economists say global factors, specifically massive supply chain snarls, are bigger culprits. Which means that even if the Bank of Canada hikes rates earlier than expected, monetary policy may not effectively cool inflation.
There is little that the Bank of Canada can do to address the biggest part of the inflation puzzle, and that is the pandemic-induced supply chain disruptions.
The Bank of Canada has said it would likely raise rates this spring or summer.
Markets are priced for a January hike. If they don't do it in January, the reason why is because they really want to make sure that everyone is prepared for it.
Regardless of when the first rate hike comes, Canadians may need to factor this kind of inflation into household budgets for the foreseeable future. A tall order for those already struggling to make ends meet. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Ukraine's allies are uniting behind the country in the face of Russia's military buildup along its borders. Today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kyiv, promising to find a diplomatic solution to the standoff. But he warned there will be a cost if Russia tries to invade or destabilize its neighbor. Michael Couture reports on how Canada and others are uniting in support of Ukraine and putting pressure on the Kremlin.
It's the arsenal that couldn't arrive soon enough for Ukraine. British anti-tank weapons and other military aid is now on the ground in Ukraine, much to the relief of the country's deputy defense minister, who insisted they will only be used in self-defense. The Kremlin claims that delivery of arms is adding to the tension in the region, even though Russia moved new battle helicopters to a base near the country's border with Ukraine, where intelligence estimates 125,000 Russian troops are already stationed.
That gives President Putin the capacity, also on very short notice, to take further aggressive action.
Canadian naval frigate HMCS Montreal left Halifax today as part of NATO's Operation Reassurance, signaling Canada's ongoing commitment to deterrence in the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Russia is looking for excuses to escalate its aggression.
We are standing there with diplomatic responses, with sanctions, with a full press on the international stage to ensure that Russia respects the people of Ukraine.
That same message is coming from Germany's Olaf Scholz. For years, his predecessor, Angela Merkel, was a strong voice willing to stand up to Vladimir Putin. The new chancellor was blunt.
About our commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and about a key principle of our common European peace order, that borders must not be moved by force.
Scholz has signaled economic sanctions are possible, like cutting off the German import of gas from Russia.
Germany could do a lot more, should do a great deal more in this case, because ultimately an invasion of Ukraine would be a threat to all the countries on the continent.
Western allies continue to say Russian aggression is unacceptable, but that was the message in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea too. Mike Lecouteur, Global News, Ottawa.
Well, Canada already has a large contingent of troops in Europe, but what more can this country do to help deter Russia? Our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson, joins us now. Mercedes, what kind of support is Ukraine asking for?
Sophie, Ukraine is looking for a way to deter an invasion, and if that's not possible, to at least slow one down. Putting Western boots on the ground in eastern Ukraine is one strategic option. Planting the Canadian flag as far east as possible with something like military trainers or observers could be enough to make Russia think twice. The troops wouldn't need to be there to fight. The mere presence of Western soldiers could mean Russia runs the risk of triggering a significant NATO military response. Whether that's something the Canadian government would consider contributing to is unclear. Canada would only participate in a combat operation if there was an American-led coalition formed. That could include anything from Canadian infantry to fighter jets, medical support, or surveillance. Right now, there are nearly 1,000 Canadian troops deployed to the region. 780 Canadian Armed Forces personnel are deployed in Operation Reassurance in Europe. There are also 200 Canadian troops in Ukraine as part of Operation Unifier, helping to train the Ukrainian military. 240 sailors are on HMCS Montreal, as Mike just mentioned in his report, and 540 soldiers are on a standing presence mission in Latvia. The Canadian Special Operations Forces are also on the ground in Ukraine, looking at options to support the Ukrainian government and contingency planning to evacuate Canadian personnel if necessary.
All right, Mercedes, what are the political considerations at play here?
The calculus is really not just about defending Ukraine, Sophie. It's about signaling support to our biggest ally, the Americans, and the very influential presence of Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, who has taken a strong stance against Russia, and of course the large voting bloc of Ukrainian Canadians here at home who want the government to act.
All right, thanks for that, Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. The U.S. president also weighing in with a warning for Russia if it invades Ukraine. In Washington tonight, Joe Biden said the country will face sanctions unlike anything it has seen before.
This is not all just a cakewalk for Russia. Militarily, they have overwhelming superiority, but they'll pay a stiff price immediately, near term, medium term, and long term if they do it.
Now, President Biden made those comments at a news conference marking his first year in office. The Ukraine crisis is by no means the only challenge he is dealing with. Jackson Proskow joins me now from Washington. Jackson, the Biden administration is facing some serious struggles at the moment.
That's right, Sophie. You know, 1 year in and the president's agenda has effectively stalled. His administration has struggled to bring the pandemic under control as the Delta and Omicron variants have swept across this country. Biden's signature plan, known as Build Back Better, is effectively dead at this point. And even measures like voting rights protections, which are hugely popular with his own base, don't actually have enough support from elected Democrats to pass. That leaves the president entering his second year looking for a complete reset. And today he hinted he's going to do that by taking a run at his Republican opponents who have openly blocked so much of his agenda.
What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for. And so the problem here is that I think what I have to do in the change in tactic, if you will, I have to make clear to the American people what we are for. So I tell my Republican friends, here I come.
Jackson, the midterm elections are less than 300 days away. How much trouble are Biden and the Democrats in right now?
You know, the polls are abysmal right now. 68% of Americans in a recent survey think the country is currently headed in the wrong direction. And Biden's own approval rating sits at just 40%. That's in the ballpark of the historically unpopular Donald Trump who came before him. Now, when it comes to turning things around, there's a sense that Americans simply want direct, measurable, and competent action, which could actually explain a sudden shift in pandemic policy from the White House. As of today, at-home rapid test kits can actually be ordered for free online to any home in the country. And the administration is also taking the step of making 400 million N95 masks available for free. These are the types of relatively simple measures that even Biden's own supporters argue he should have been doing months ago. Sophie?
Jackson Proskow in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. Now to the COVID situation in Canada. In Ontario, Health Minister Christine Elliott says there are glimmers of hope in the fight to get control of the Omicron-fueled fifth wave.
We are beginning to see signs of stabilization. Omicron cases are expected to peak this month. New hospitalizations are slowing and are now doubling closer to every 2 weeks.
Ontario is expected to announce a gradual easing of restrictions in the coming days, although the province is warning February will likely be another challenging month, with hospitals still dealing with the impacts of that fifth wave. In England, the government says it appears the Omicron wave has now peaked and it is ready to start easing restrictions. Starting next Thursday, face masks in public places and proof of vaccination will no longer be required. The government is also immediately scrapping the advice to work from home. The British health minister says efforts to blunt the impacts of Omicron have worked. He warns, however, that people must learn to live with COVID the same way we live with the flu. Well, critics of Boris Johnson say they don't have to live with him as their prime minister, though.
In the name of God, go.
Coming up, the growing calls to quit. Plus, city switcher, why Indonesia is getting a new capital. There's new trouble for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson after accusations he lied about lockdown parties. Today, one of his own MPs defected to the opposition, and a veteran Conservative MP and former cabinet minister joined calls for his resignation.
I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Willie O'Ree to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Johnson responded by defending his government's record, but pressure to step down is growing. A minimum of 54 Conservative MPs must submit formal letters of no confidence to trigger a vote on his leadership. It's unclear exactly how many have been written so far, although a handful of MPs have openly called for his resignation. Phone service is being restored in Tonga after that massive undersea volcanic eruption over the weekend. New images are giving us a better idea of the damage that cut off communication to the rest of the world. Entire homes have been destroyed with debris scattered across communities. International calling has apparently been restored, but internet connections could take over a month to fix. Indonesia's government has approved a bill to relocate its capital. It will be called Nusantara. That translates to archipelago, fitting for a country made up of more than 17,000 islands. Construction can now get underway on the island of Borneo, about 2,000 kilometers away from the current capital, Jakarta. Jakarta is densely populated and congested, and it's sinking at an alarming rate. It was built on swampland, and the over-extraction of groundwater has caused more than 40% of the city to sink below sea level. The first phase of the government's move to Nusantara could begin in 2024. Racism in Canadian healthcare. Ahead, the barriers Indigenous patients face. A steady stream of drivers gassed up in Merritt, BC today as the major highway connecting the interior to Metro Vancouver reopened to regular traffic. Just 2 months ago, catastrophic flooding destroyed more than 100 kilometers of the Coquihalla Highway between Hope and Merritt. Crews worked around the clock to reopen the route, first to commercial traffic in just 35 days, and today to the rest of the public. The city of Iqaluit has shut down its water treatment plant after fuel was again discovered in the supply. The city says a breach was found in the system last week and again today after residents reported a fuel smell in the tap water. Iqaluit was under a boil water advisory for 2 months last year for the same issue. Indigenous people have long said they are not taken seriously in Canada's healthcare system, and now there is data to back that up. A study analyzing millions of emergency room visits in Alberta found Indigenous patients were treated as less urgent, even if their complaints were the same as other patients. As Heather Yourex-West reports, advocates hope this research will help combat systemic racism.
Pamela Beebe has spent much of her professional life advocating for truth and reconciliation. But in her personal life, she's had to spend a great deal of time advocating for her family's health care.
When somebody has to go to the emergency room and get sent home right away, nobody is surprised in my family. We get asked immediately, like, are you on drugs? Are you high? Why are your eyes red? Like all these questions around that are just not appropriate.
Beebe is not alone, and now new research published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal has found evidence that Indigenous people consistently experience discrimination within Alberta emergency rooms.
So some real hard quantitative data that systemic racism exists.
That's right, exactly.
Using data from Alberta hospitals, researchers found First Nations routinely receive lower acuity triage scores, important because patients with higher scores are given a higher priority for care.
What happens from the data that we see is that people who are from the First Nations community are put down lower in the list to be seen for those same types of injuries as people who are not from the First Nations community.
The Alberta research adds to a growing body of evidence that systemic anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare is a national problem.
We found pervasive interpersonal systemic racism.
A 2020 inquiry found 84% of Indigenous patients experienced discrimination within BC's health system. And of course, no one can forget the tragic death of Joyce Echaquan. The Atikamekw woman died in a Quebec hospital days after live streaming this video. On her chart, a nurse had identified her as a drug abuser in withdrawal. It wasn't true.
It makes us very reticent to access healthcare services, and we don't do so unless we absolutely have to.
Whether it's the researchers in the Alberta study, the coroner's report in Quebec, or the inquiry in BC, the key recommendations are the same. Systemic racism within the Canadian healthcare system exists, and a reckoning is overdue.
Whether they're nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, security guards, everybody needs to gain skills in how to address their bias and be aware of it.
In order to ensure all Indigenous people have equitable access to care. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
More than just a number. Next, the hockey world honors a Canadian who changed the game. The woman known as the Queen of Basketball has died. Lucia Harris is the only woman drafted by an NBA team. She's also the first player to score in Olympic women's basketball history, sinking the first basket in the 1976 Montreal Games. Harris went on to become the first Black woman inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. She's being remembered for her charity and what she did both on and off the court. Harris was 66. Another sports pioneer was honored by the NHL last night. Willie O'Ree, the league's first Black player, had his jersey retired by the Boston Bruins. As Mike Drolet reports, even without a lengthy NHL career, his impact on hockey can still be felt on and off the ice.
It's fair to say Willie O'Ree's expectations never included seeing his jersey retired by the Boston Bruins. Maybe not even his dreams. As a young man growing up in the 1950s, his sole focus was on just making it to the NHL.
All I wanted was to be a hockey player. All I needed was the opportunity.
He was so overwhelmed when the Bruins called him up in 1958, he only learned he had made history as the first black man to play in the NHL the following day.
It was the greatest thrill of my life, I believe. I'll always remember this day.
In the first period, you looked like you were a little nervous, were you?
Yes, a bit.
It scared you a little,
Yes, it did.
And O'Ree goes back for Boston.
O'Ree would play 45 games over 2 seasons before embarking on a successful career in the minor leagues. It was never easy.
Yeah, I heard the racial remarks and racial slurs, and it was in Chicago and New York, probably the worst problems I had.
Like baseball's Jackie Robinson before him, he endured in relative silence. In fact, he never told any of his teams that an errant puck had left him blind in one eye for fear they wouldn't let him play. And while his NHL career was short, 45 games in all, his impact is almost impossible to gauge. Countless minorities now play hockey because of outreach programs he helped build. And former NHLer George Laraque says he never fails to give O'Ree credit when speaking to children.
I'd always talk about the history of the game. And to me, it's always so important to tell them that, you know what, I know you guys looked up to me, but if it wasn't for him, you would have never seen me play.
Sadly, racism still permeates the hockey world. It's a reality the NHL is working to change.
Seeing the jersey go up is a reminder to people that it wasn't just white people who played hockey. There are lots of other cultures and races that are playing hockey. And that we need to be inclusive.
And that would be a dream legacy for Willie O'Ree. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday night. I'm Sophie Louie. Tonight's Your Canada is Cavendish Beach on the north shore of Prince Edward Island. There are beautiful spots all over Canada. Please email us yours to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching and have a good night.